Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you for this conversation today with Minister Jaishankar, Minister of External Affairs of India. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council. I couldn't be more pleased to welcome you back to the United States, back to the Atlantic Council, now as Minister. We're delighted to have you here. We're also delighted to welcome Ambassador, our terrific partner in the work we do. This conversation today is part of a broader strategic context that we'll hear from the Indian perspective from the minister, but also for the Atlantic Council itself, where we've made a strategic bet on what's happening in South Asia and on India in particular. This is a place that has a mission, a purpose of how the United States works constructively with allies and partners to solve big global challenges. And part of our strategy is premised on the fact that on all of these global challenges, we want India as a strategic partner on helping to solve many of these key problems. That's why we've made an investment in the South Asia Center. We're delighted to have Dr. Irfan Noordin now running a South Asia Center stood up by Shuja Nawaz over a decade ago. Today we've gathered a community here across Washington that is invested in the relationship between the United States and India. I'm delighted that we have leadership on our board driving this effort. Paula Dobryansky, Ankit Desai, Frank Kramer will be joining us as well. And that we're here joined by officials from the U.S. government, Christopher Wilson, Tom Vida, also former government officials, Kirk Campbell, Mark Linscott, who's leading our effort on trade with India, and of course Ambassador Richard Verma, former U.S. ambassador to India. But we've brought together a diverse group, including the private sector, to represent the importance of what is building the U.S.-India relationship. The minister's here in Washington after a pretty extraordinary trip across the United States with Prime Minister Modi, beginning in Houston, a remarkable trip joined by President Donald Trump and over 25 members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, followed, of course, by the marathon sessions in where the leaders met again. This conversation here will be on the record, will be broadcast on our social media channels, on the record. And for us, I think many of you around the table know the minister, India's foremost foreign policy strategist. Before his recent appointment as Minister of External Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar served, of course, as ambassador to the United States, where he worked with many of you, but also as an ambassador to China, ambassador to the Czech Republic, India's foreign secretary. He's been a longtime friend of the Atlantic Council since he first joined the Indian Embassy in 2013. He's been a stalwart proponent of the U.S.-India relationship. His leadership has been instrumental in fostering a strong and growing bilateral relationship between our two countries and in developing a cohesive response to the rising challenges that we see in the Indo-Pacific. So since our founding, the Atlantic Council's mission has been to advocate for constructive U.S. engagement with friends and allies. This conversation today is part of this effort to build public awareness, but also our own understanding of India's view of a set of global issues, and to help underscore the case that the United States, working with a strategic partner, working with allies like India, can do much more to advance principles and democratic principles in an increasingly turbulent world. Of course, as the world's largest democracy and one of its most influential powers, India is an ideal partner to work with as part of our guiding mission. It's why we've made this investment in our South Asia Center, the Big Trade Initiative, our Democratic Order Initiative, where India is a key partner, and in our new Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council, we're taking a big bet to work with Indian cities such as Chennai on issues of climate, water, access, to help build and support a common investment in the principles of security, prosperity, and individual liberty for our people. So against that backdrop, very honored to invite our distinguished guest, Dr. Jaishankar, to address the opportunities for India's future engagement with the United States and its allies to invest in our mutual interest. I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Minister, and then Dr. Irfan Noordin, our director of the South Asia Center, will moderate the conversation. So with that, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be back at the Atlantic Council. Let me begin actually by recognizing two people who are not here, but who for me in many ways were the engagement when I was ambassador and earlier, which is Fred Kemp and John Huntsman. And I'm delighted to, I know many of you, but I'm particularly delighted to see Ambassador Dobryansky, because the two of us worked on the kind of issues that I'm going to talk about when we were both in the administration. So, look, when I thought I should come and, avail of your invitation, I felt I should really address what is the core mission of this institution, which was initially, to my understanding, a body which was set up to promote transatlantic understanding, and then has grown beyond that to actually take on the responsibility of engaging the world beyond the transatlantic world as well. So my remarks today are really focused on those sets of issues, which in a sense you could say, how does India relate to the West? How does the West hopefully relate to India? And where do we go on from here? Now, many of you would have heard in another country the term century of humiliation. Okay. India actually had 2 centuries of humiliation with the West, because the West kind of in its predatory form came into India in the mid-18th century and continued almost exactly for 190 years after that. And it was interesting, I think a year ago, there was actually a very serious economic study which tried to estimate how much the British took out of India in value terms. And a very calculated math ended up, put a number of $45 trillion at today's value. So that should give you a sense of really what happened in those 200 years. So while we will speak of all the things we shared today, the reality also is that the history of India and the West is also a history of famine, of slavery, of opium trade. So there is a very dark side to all of this. Now, this is the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. It's almost on October 2nd is actually the birth anniversary. And I think it's worth a while to pause and reflect on how a leader like him actually changed India's attitude towards the West. That in 1947, when India got independence, it need not have had the kind of relationship with the West which it did thereafter. We can debate the merits of it, but I think it's extraordinary in a way that a country which struggled so long for its independence, after that actually reached informal understanding or a compact, in a sense, with the West. And I would sort of regard that as really the ability to set history aside and allow, politics and economics and social connections to take over. So what you don't see in India and have not seen for the last 70 years, even at the most difficult times with the West, has been a kind of mobilization around an anti-Western nationalism. It has been actually, in many ways, I would say, a cordial relationships. If it was not cordial, it was certainly not frictional. Part of that was also the way we, set up our own institutions and created our own society. And at the end of the day, the fact that we are a liberal democracy, the fact that there is a governance model based on a rule of law, the fact that there is social pluralism, and that we are a market economy, I think these were all really very powerful factors which actually enabled us to put that history behind us. And here I would make one point before shifting to my next argument, which is that India's choices in 1947 and thereafter actually took what were Western values and Western practices and made them near universal. So today, if you have in the developed world or the South, or whatever you call it, really Asia, Africa, parts of Latin America, if you have today a belief that democracy is an ethically superior model of governance, in part it is due to the fact that the first big post-colonial polity actually chose that and then sustained it despite extraordinary odds over the last 70 years. So let's look at the last 70 years, and these last 70 years have really been a very complex history. At one level, I would say the West has actually been very, very supportive of India's growth, India's rise, if you would. You can see that in politics, you can see that in security, in trade, in investment, in services, in education, in particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in development assistance of various kinds. You can see that in the where the Indian diaspora, particularly the more modern voluntary diaspora, is located. I would say, that 40s to perhaps the late 90s, I mean, let's say the 20th century in that sense. This was a period where actually this what I described, a cordial, non-frictional relationship was largely in play, and I think it's had a very invaluable role really in building the India that we have today. But having said that, it is what I would call a sort of a Goldilocks era of our relationship, which is the West didn't want India to get too weak, it didn't want India to get too strong, so it stirred the Indian porridge, or tried to stir the Indian porridge just right, and sometimes, got it, say there were margins of error on either side. So you actually have a very interesting sort of situation where when India, in 1962, after the conflict where we were defeated, actually the West comes to the assistance of India. But in less than a decade, in 1971, when it seems to the West that India is seeking a primacy in the subcontinent, the West opposes India. So there's a sort of a bandwidth in which the relationship operates. Now, this bandwidth is not just episodic. I mean, if you look, where is it that we got our relationship right and where is it we did not? Pretty much across the development spectrum, the West was very supportive. But when it came to industrialization, particularly in heavy industries, or when it came to defense and security, the West was very conservative. So you had sort of both geopolitical or political moments as well as sectors where there was this very interesting, I would say, almost a management of relations. And today, if you go to the archives and, a lot of where the internal thinking of multiple administrations are are there for people to access. I think it's most starkly actually laid out by President Eisenhower, but you can see strains of it before him, after him, through multiple administrations. But this idea that how do you keep India in play? A weak India is bad for American Western interests. An excessively strong India is also a problem of a kind. By the way, those days mostly they worried about a weak India. This in a sense was the sort of scenario through the 20th century. Now, somewhere along the way, that began to change, and I'll talk about it. But even though it's changed, I do believe some of the structural issues where there are divergences between India and the West do continue. It's visible on trade, it's visible on IPR issues. It can be visible sometimes on issues of non-proliferation, freedom, civil rights. Which cause do you support, which cause do you not? Sometimes we look at situations where we say, why is the West broadly and the US looking away from what is a visible violation of rights? There'd be times when in some form the same question would be asked of us. And the bottom line for me really is, for all that we have in common, we also need to recognize that we are coming from a different place and we do have different histories. So a lot of the challenge today for us is to reconcile that. So having stated that, what is our current conundrum? From the Indian side, I think there's a clear sense that the power of the West remains very strong. That if you look at the world, the institutions, the regimes, the rules, the practices, the narratives of the world are still largely shaped by the West. The West underwrites international system in many ways. It really governs the global commons also in many ways. But having said that, what has been visible, particularly in the last 10 years, and in the case of China, perhaps even before that, there is a rebalancing underway. The rebalancing was accelerated by the 2008 global financial crisis. And what was initially seen as an economic rebalancing is actually today become a much larger, I would say, strategic cultural rebalancing as well. And if there is a sort of a single way by which you could capture that, it's the fact today that the G20 has really replaced the G7 as the primary body for global deliberations. Now, while I say that the West still retains great dominance over the international system, it's also a fact that we see a much more divided West, and part of the reason is that the United States is the glue that holds the West together. And I use West in the largest, most expansive sense of the term. I mean, I would call Japan in that sense as part of the West, or perhaps Korea. So I use the, not really a geographical or a ethnic definition, but I capture the alliance constructs or the OECD part of it as well. And so today, as the world is getting more multipolar, the West is also getting more multipolar. And that's a very interesting dynamic when you look at the West. Now, I see two propositions. One, that the West needs India. It needs India because India is an additional engine of growth, that the market access is important, that India's human resources will become more relevant to the world, that we will move to a multipolar world, have in a sense moved to it, and therefore it's important to manage the multipolarity by having good relations with multiple worlds. The fact that in many areas there would be burden sharing of some kind. You can already see that, for example, in HADR operations in our part of the world. And then on global issues, it's important to work with a country like India, and I think nothing illustrates that more than climate change and what happened at Paris. But having said that, I would make the converse argument, which is India needs the West. And India needs the West for a variety of reasons, but I would give you the simplest historical argument for it, which is that every major growth story in the last 150 years has actually paradoxically happened with the support of the West. So whether it is the rise of Japan, whether even the rise of Soviet Union, the rise of Korea, of the ASEAN, of China, all these would not have been possible had they not been done in tandem with the Western interests and Western thinking of that period. The direction of the global economy would also make a stronger argument for this bonding, because as we move into a world of a more knowledge economy world, one of greater technology interdependence, clearly an important factor would be the flow of talent in the world. And there I would suggest that actually India has a somewhat unique position vis-a-vis the economies of the West. So the question which flows from all of this is it possible, is it likely that there's actually a new compact between India and the West? Because if this rebalancing has to be reflected in a different equilibrium, in different equations, in new methods of working each other, is there actually a sense of how to work that out? So that brings me then to the next question. What does it take us to get to that new compact? And obviously the first point there is to have the realization that there's a need for a new compact. I think that realization is today strong in the United States. I see that to a certain extent in Japan. I see that less in Europe, but moving in the right direction. So it is even the awareness aspect of it clearly needs more work, and for this to develop further. Now, when I say what does it take, I would say that awareness, first of all, needs to translate itself into a recognition of the need for a new balance, which means you really have different kinds of collaborations, different conversations. And in all of this, obviously, India would hedge enough to make sure that it will always have a strong bargaining hand vis-a-vis the West. So the fact that India has other equities and other activities does not detract from what will be, at the end of the day, sort of a central aspect of its foreign policy direction. There are other aspects of what it takes, and one of them is also an understanding of a changed India. A changed India that democratization over the last 70 years in India has had its own impact. That if you look today at India, the politics of India, the social aspects of India, bluntly put, the old elite is now out of business. And really, you have a new set of people with their, different thoughts, with their own, sense of roots, who relate to the world obviously differently from the people who dominated the Indian political scene before them. A third aspect of it, certainly from the Indian point of view, would be one part of it is how do you build bridges, and there the role of the diaspora would be very important. But increasingly, what we can see is that the treatment of the diaspora abroad becomes a factor in India's responses to a particular country or society. So I see that really not just as a conversation between India and its diaspora, but also a factor in our relations with other countries and other partners. Now, and in a sense, that's a two-way factor, because the diaspora also relates to, particularly the Indian diaspora relates much more to development in home country than many other diasporas do. That's something we can discuss if there's interest. From the Indian point of view, as I said, we've in the past noted the fact that the current world order is very much built on institutions and practices which were advanced, which were created, envisaged, and socialized by the West. But we also, frankly, looking ahead, our sense is really the theories of the decline of the West are grossly overstated. That if you look at technology, if you look at even defense budgets, if you look at the will to exercise power, in all of this, if you look at new instruments of pressure which have appeared on the international scene in the last 10 years, in all of this, actually, the West very much maintains its leads. So the task before us, if we are to move in this direction, is one, of course, to strengthen our convergences. And there are issues today, very obvious issues to work together, issues like counterterrorism, issues like maritime security, issues like connectivity. But there will also be divergences, and I think part of the challenge would be to manage those. A lot of those would arise in third country situations like Russia or Iran. And some of it would also be to overcome history. That one of the, I would say, the burdens that India carries is the fact that it was not a central part of the 1945 order. It wasn't on the high table at that point of time. So how do you make the world more contemporary? How do you make the world order more contemporaneous? And here I would argue that it is very much in the interest of the West to do that. But it's obviously, again, not a task that is easy. The symbol of that is the UN Security Council, but that's not the only facet of that particular argument. So I would end with a concluding observation, which is that as India itself rises, we are today the 5th or 6th largest economy. We certainly would be the 3rd largest economy, even in nominal terms, by 2030. We will be the most populous country in less than the next 5 years. So the question which we ask ourselves, and I guess in a way the world asks itself, is really what kind of power India would be. And I think a large part of that answer is obviously with that, but I think one part of that answer is also with the West, and what kind of relationship we now forge together, to my mind, would really give us the full picture. So why don't I stop my remarks there, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Jaishankar, for essentially giving us the Jaishankar doctrine. And what I thought was anyway going to be a fascinating conversation has sort of been elevated by your willingness to engage in a preview, really, of a strategic vision of how India engages with the West in the 21st century under your leadership and the leadership of your government. Thank you, Ambassador Shringla and your team from the embassy, all of you honored guests. We're very grateful that you would take time this morning to join us. So I'm going to ask the Minister a couple of questions to get this conversation going, and then, of course, open it up. You can indicate using your name tent if you want to ask a question. I'm happy to call on you. And again, just a reminder that this is on the record. So, Dr. Jaishankar, let's start with, in a sense, a softball, if you would, right? We'll start the bouncers in a minute. But so starting with the Prime Minister's appearance with President Trump in Houston, then a very full week, as Damon alluded to, of bilateral and multilateral meetings in New York, and then last afternoon with Secretary Pompeo in the evening. You've probably you will leave Washington and leave the United States with a much clearer sense of how the West, as you've described them, is thinking about India at this particular moment in time, what the real challenges are to get the US-India relationship to where you would like it to be. Would you be willing to give us a bit of a readout, as it were, about what you take away from this very long set of meetings over the last week?
First, my meetings aren't over yet. So I still have a few more secretaries to go. So I'm meeting Secretary Esper, I think, tomorrow, and the new NSA, as well as the Homeland Security Acting Secretary. And we're meeting a lot of business in different formats. But look, I mean, to my mind, that I'd kind of put my interest areas in two broad baskets, okay? One would be really the politics of the West, particularly the internal politics of the West, because, I mean, it's, to say that the Western societies are today having an active debate would be the understatement of the year. Every one of them, in some form, has that as an ongoing activity. But really, it's actually a very, I mean, to my mind, really, these few years are going to also probably take us in a very different direction than in the past. That's very obvious. And it's also obvious it's very differentiated. You know, I spend a lot of time in Europe, not just in this job, even in my previous job. And you can see today that if you take the breadth of the political spectrum, both to the left and the right, I mean, on both sides, actually, there's been a kind of a expansion, if you would. And I think to a large extent, that's true of American politics as well. And when you have, you know, the two extremes expanding, you obviously have, in each case, much sharper arguments within. But our concern is not to get into those arguments, because we look at the aggregate outcome and where do individual power centers and nations stand, where do they stand collectively. And that really brings me to the second basket. And the second basket is really the economic technology basket, if you would, because I I think the rate of change, rate of social change in the world is so extraordinary today, and the importance of technology, it holds a promise actually beyond our imagination, that if you were to think back every 5 years, you couldn't have imagined where you were out there. And what does that then do for our relationship? Because in India, we can't grow the old-fashioned way. We can't go up the manufacturing ladder and then industrialize and then scale it up. So we'll have to kind of do a very unique mix of leapfrogging, of shortcuts, of improvisations. So if you were to ask me, so how is India going to grow? Would it be manufacturing? Would it be services? Would it be startups? Would it be skills? Would it be exports? Would it be globalized, talent-driven? Would it be insular? My answer would be all of the above, because I think we'll kind of end up in that situation. And that kind of India and this much more differentiated, complex West, their coming together to me is really a proposition which is very desirable, but is clearly not just not inevitable, but not easy. It will have its challenges. There will be issues, there will be decisions we would make, which some segments here may not like. It would work the other way around as well. And we'll have to take our lumps as we try to forge different, better relationship. So I leave after this trip even more fascinated by the internal discourse of the places I visit. But I also leave confident from everybody, and I met and all the conversations that I had, that there is if there are some issues on which everybody agrees today, certainly the idea that the Western world, and especially the United States, which, as I said, has been the thought leader in that direction, the fact that our relationship today has a strategic significance, I think I leave very confident of that.
In that case, let me ask, it's sort of strange for those of us, or maybe surprising, strange is the wrong word, surprising, that for a relationship, a bilateral relationship that was so forged by economic ties, driven by the diaspora, driven by investment, and in fact a real skepticism to ties on the security side, defense, etc., that now the good news appears to be on the defense side. Interoperability is no longer apparently a no-go term. The conversations that occurred with the Quad, as it were, and yet the economic side of the story seems to be more conflictual. And in particular, the government's, I'm going to call it a mantra, though that's not quite fair, that data is the new oil, suggests that on digital there's a real divergence of views about how to make this relationship more productive, more fruitful for both sides. To the extent that data is the new oil, in that sense it comes into MEA's remit, right? Oil is the ultimate, oil is the ultimate foreign policy conversation. So if you could help us think about, should we be anticipating difficult but friendly conversations, or is this not going to see resolution anytime in the near future because the points of difference are too vast?
If you again look at the history of India and the United States especially, there's, whether politics has primacy or economics has primacy, has been sort of an uneven picture. There have been times when actually the relationship has been much more politically driven. There have been times when actually the economic forces have come into play. My sense is today we probably have a better balance than we did ever before. And there are a number of reasons for it. Obviously the economic side has grown as the Indian economy has grown. And the Indian economy, as I said, has also grown with the West. Post 92, frankly, without the encouragement of West, the next 25 years wouldn't have happened. But the politics has also changed because, in a sense, the world has changed. The old the old correlations of power no longer apply to that extent. New powers have arisen, new issues have arisen. the United States itself is thinking today beyond, not just today, it's been actually thinking for some years now, beyond the alliance structure. In fact, I would cite even the nuclear deal as a very sharp example of an administration which actually saw 20 years ahead of its time and said, this is a big obstacle to the development of the relationship with India. I mean, at the end of the day, the nuclear deal was not just about the nuclear, it was about something much bigger. The point I would make is that, that balancing will keep going. But today, I would caution you against overstating that economic friction, because I think if I look at the numbers, okay, the numbers are not going south. The numbers are still good, pretty much in every sphere. What has happened is that there is a degree of spotlight on trade and economic issues, which was not there earlier. There is a salience to those issues in the overall policy making in Washington, which was not there earlier. So it's much more, it's like what you were arguing in the dark corners of the room, you're now arguing out there with the mic on. Now, I think just because you're having a loud argument doesn't make it an intractable argument. My sense is, okay, you'll push us, we'll push back, do a little bit of this. And finally, some kind of adjustment, some kind of accommodation would happen, because I've frankly seen much more difficult issues which have been creatively resolved. So I can't believe that people today are less ingenious than we were in our time. So I'm reasonably confident that we will find a fix. But one of the challenges is really how do you define the issue for which you're trying to find a fix? I mean, are you looking at immediate trade frictions? Are there legacy issues you want to resolve? Are there things on the horizon? Are you looking at future policy making? And I think those are decisions which both sides really need to have conversations about, which comes to the data issue. Now, where data is concerned, look, in a sense that what does the statement that data is the new oil mean? I mean, it just means that today, data has a value in the international market. Data can be commercialized. Data can be traded. And therefore, data is a business. Okay? So, if data is a business and data is a value, obviously nobody gives away anything of value for free. I haven't seen any country, including the United States, be that generous. The fact is, as data becomes more relevant to everyday business, people will wake up and say, I'm actually, I'm sitting on a gold mine of 1.3 billion people's data. Now, why would I not leverage that? I mean, if our roles were reversed, would the United States hesitate to do it? Of course not. So, but I don't think data as oil should be taken as a sort of an autarkic statement. Okay. I think that would be a misreading of what the intent is. And there's also this issue that, look, at the end of the day, whatever India does in a particular sector would have to be set against a larger context. I mean, India is not an autarkic economy. The Indian economy has grown with the world. Even if you look at the last few years, the number of sectors which have opened up to foreign investment have grown, they have not shrunk. So I would say this is a new area. There will be arguments, there will be, the US obviously has an enormous lead over the rest of the world. And the US has its own debate, by the way, about what are the issues associated with the big tech companies. I mean, you don't need Indian to say that. I mean, there are American senators who today talk about those concerns. So those will all be debated within your country, between us, within my country. Our data policies are in the making. Clearly, if I'm still in a policy making stage, I'm probably not ready to maybe I'll discuss, but if you haven't made a policy, you don't negotiate what you haven't decided on. So that's really where we are.
Thank you. I want to start by asking Senior Fellow Mark Linscott to ask a first question, and then I'll follow that up with Ambassador Dobriansky. Maybe we can take both questions, and you can respond as you'd like.
Thank you, Irfan. Thank you, Minister. And I will start by confessing that I'm a former trade negotiator. And that's not to say that it's not an honorable profession, but I certainly bear the scars from many trade battles. I'm sure I've inflicted some. But even with that experience, I'm hugely optimistic about the future of the bilateral trade relationship. And this is an opportunity to pitch our Atlantic Council study, which is a vision for the future. It's all premised on an early agreement, an effort to get a deal to solve some of the immediate so-called irritants. And negotiations on trade between the United States and India are never easy. In fact, I think one of the first documented disputes was in the early 1950s, soon after the creation of the modern multilateral trading system, the GATT. I think it involved almonds, of all things. What are the prospects for an agreement? Many of us were quite surprised that there was not an agreement when the leaders met last Tuesday. Are there good prospects for an agreement in the next week or two? And is there a danger that as that meeting between the leaders becomes more distant, that some of the impetus diminishes for getting an agreement?
Thank you very much, and also thank you so much for coming to the Council and using this as a platform, if I could say, to express that very thoughtful vision and of what you see next in the relationship. So thank you for that. As you were speaking, just a brief comment, as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think, to me, a turning point, as you were tracking it historically, the evolution of the relationships, I was thinking of when George W. Bush was running for president, and he stated at the Reagan Library that he wanted the U.S.-India relationship and India to become a strategic partner. And then that led to the nuclear deal, ultimately, as you know, and so many ways in which engagement with India had been broadened. And that was mutual. The move on from his statement, and then, of course, with the leadership in India at the time and the movement forward. I wanted to underscore, you mentioned that there's a rebalancing underway. And I think that's absolutely the case. Certainly because, one, just even the naming, the Indo-Pacific Command, the restructuring in terms of the way policy is looked at for the whole region. You're a force, you're a factor in that. But it's not only that, the Quad, as Irfan mentioned, the Malabar exercises that took place, and then no less in the trade area, the special status on export controls, too, that was accorded last year. So let me just come to this. I think you lay out a very important vision, but the question is two parts. What do you see as the core concrete ways forward that you would prioritize as moving it into a new compact, if you will, and bringing it up to a higher level? And then secondly, what are the fundamental obstacles from your perspective that you see? I ask that because Irfan mentioned interoperability. You do have military relationships and that factor into how you go forward. What obstacles do you see? Thank you. Oh, maybe.
Okay. Mark, I would say probably the only thing more scarring than being a trade negotiator is to be a nuclear negotiator. And I live to tell the tale, so I guess, and you have lived to tell yours, so I guess it's not that bad. But look, my sense of it, and I would honestly confess, I have a sort of somewhat once removed picture of what was happening in the room. I do believe that there were multiple rounds of very positive conversations and on the trade issue. I wasn't entirely sanguine about anything being announced when the President and the Prime Minister met in New York, partly because it was New York and it wasn't Washington. You know, people work harder when they actually have a sort of a Washington event deadline to meet. But joking apart, it actually was, I think they needed more time. I think many of the issues were more complex. If you actually obviously put more things on the table, you know this better than any of us do on this table. And sometimes how each side approaches it is different. So how do you reconcile approaches? That itself is an issue. But having said that, you know, I certainly on our side, we didn't encourage those expectations to be articulated that somehow there's going to be some kind of deal by last week. So I would, and I've been saying this, and I've been telling our friends from the Indian press as well, saying that, look, trade deals are much more complicated than you folks think. It isn't simple arithmetic. There are a lot of variables out there. So you'll have to work our way through that. But you know your old colleagues well, and you know that, you know, at the end of the day, if they have to get a job done, they'll get it done. On the you know, the concrete ways by which we can move forward. I mean, look, it's happening in many ways as we speak. I mean, if you look at all the agreements, the mechanisms, the discussions, the exchanges, I mean, you look back over the last 15 years, I mean, a simple thing, like, I mean, he's talking of interoperability. Now, how many of you would even know the fact that till 2005 we didn't buy anything from the United States? You know, from 1965 till 2005, there were simply no defense transactions between the two countries. So from buying, you know, something defense to actually even talking about the ability to operate together is an enormous sort of job. So to my mind, you know, it's not rocket science, you know. If you know, we need obviously to do more business. We obviously need to look at areas of growth in each country. We have to do all the obvious things, which is where our political interests converge, work together publicly, visibly. We, you know, have to do the defense security cooperation. We have to take on responsibilities sometimes which the rest of the world will not. So there's all of that. But to my mind, there are two obstacles which you had leveled, and they are conceptual obstacles, which is, you know, we both have habits, okay? And habits are actually the hardest thing to let go, okay? Ask anybody who smokes. Now, because there are habits, you know, or actually sometimes to get a system to do something which it has not done before is a huge challenge. I mean, I've struggled, you know, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, to get somebody to change the title of, you know, I'm willing to do the substance, but change the packaging, call it something else. It's no, we don't do it. We do it with everybody else. That's the way it is. So that can happen, you know, that happens. And on our side too, I'm not suggesting that all the problems are on the American side. I mean, the most common answer you get when you try to do something different is, well, I can't do it because I've never done it before. You know, we don't do this. So that we don't do this is a very, very powerful argument when it comes to policy making. So the other part of it is, when we start doing things, we need to put ourselves in each other's shoes. That, you know, I need to understand, okay, if I were an American or whatever, a French, whichever country I'm in, you know, what are their compulsions? Where are they coming from? Why are they asking me what they're asking me? And what is it, to my best assessment, they can accept or not accept? And the other way around. Now, if, for example, look, I'd speak from my perspective. I mean, we are a very independent country, and the reasons, very good reasons in history why we are so. So the idea that, you know, the basis for doing something would be to compromise on our freedom of action, on our independence, that would be something which would make it very difficult for us. But we would hope that as we get to know each other, there is that understanding on the other side. That people say, well, look, this is India we're talking about, this is how they think, this is what is important to them, so let's work within that. And then, obviously we need to mirror image that as well. So this getting out of habits and building comfort, and the building comfort is a higher order of getting out of habits. That I think is really something which is very challenging. It doesn't happen overnight. Frankly, it doesn't. It takes, we've now been at it maybe 15 years, 20 years. It's still work in progress.
Thank you. Ambassador Samad, and then Ritika.
Thank you. Good morning, Minister. I'm a former Afghan diplomat and now affiliated with the Council. Thank you so much for this fascinating overview, strategic overview and outlook. I want to bring it down from the big picture to something smaller, having to do with the region and geopolitics. You talked about how India relates to the West and vice versa. And one such place right now is Afghanistan. And I wanted to get your sense from your current visits to New York and still going on in DC. What do you think will happen with the stalled peace process that the United States started at one point, is now sort of on hold? Do you think, from the Indian perspective, that at this stage, given the dynamics in the region, India-Pakistan relationship issues, internal Afghanistan issues, including a new election that took place in the continuation of the war, that we're at a point where we have to make a decision about whether to pursue a kinetic path for a certain time, or it's better to move back to something that is more political in order to aim for a settlement that is acceptable. So do you think it's better from an Indian perspective to build consensus, political consensus, moving towards a settlement, or that there's a choice at this point for more kinetics, then leading to something more political? How do you see this unraveling?
The ambassador has requested, because he'd like to hear everyone's questions, so we'll take the full tranche, and then he can choose how to respond. So Ritika, next.
Morning, sir. I was watching your CNA interview last night, and the one thing that stuck with me, that registered with me, was very well articulated, that we are a large developing economy doesn't mean that we are not developing economy. We are just large. So thanks for that. I will use that very often. My question is, when we look at the trade relations across the world right now, where, without naming countries, but a lot of them are not appreciating multilateral platforms, instead going ahead with bilateral, whilst India is also negotiating an RCEP, almost on the finishing line. How difficult or easy do you think this whole trade negotiation across the world is, where some recognize multilateral and some would much rather prefer bilateral?
Ruja? Could you turn your mic on?
Thank you. Good to have you back, Ambassador. My question is about the President's intervention on Kashmir. Were you aware that this was going to happen? President Trump was going to leap into the Kashmir issue and offer to be a mediator, arbitrator. He keeps adjusting his terminology between India and Pakistan. And secondly, what do you think accounts for what appears to be a very unusual amount of publicity given to Indian actions in Kashmir by the US media? That seems to have not taken its lead from the President's statement, but seems to have accompanied it.
Ash?
Ash Jain, I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. Sir, you made a very compelling argument for a new kind of compact between the United States, between India and the West, built on shared values, shared interests. And so my question is, when you talk about the need for new institutions, updating those institutions for the rules, for the future of the rules-based order, How do you see the role of institutions like the Quad, which bring together democracies and try to build closer strategic alignment? Is there a need to look for other avenues to build on those kinds of constructs, and how is India willing to play a role in that regard?
And Teresa, you get the last question.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for your remarks this morning. I wanted to follow up on your point about the diaspora and how the treatment of diaspora abroad plays a role in bilateral relations. Anti-immigrant harassment and hate crimes have gone up in the United States in the past couple of years. A high-profile case being the hate crime killing of an Indian man in Olaf, Kansas in 2017. So is there at all concern about how or what message Prime Minister Modi might be sending to the Indian or Indian American diaspora by so openly embracing President Trump, such as in the most recent rally in Houston? Is there a concern that this affection might be construed as sort of condoning this type of rhetoric and behavior, and what that might fuel? Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll keep my answers very short because I've got I'm running a clock out there. Look, on the what happens in Afghanistan, I mean, the U.S. specifically and the NATO has the lead role on where the situation is likely to go where so far as the external powers are concerned. We have, I mean, I don't have to tell you if you're an Afghan that, India has a relationship with that country, with that society, which is historical. It was there, it'll keep continuing, it will be in the future as well. But at this time, it would not, it doesn't make sense for me that India should advance prescriptions. I mean, India can have an approach. I mean, obviously, anybody's approach would be who would not prefer a negotiated outcome. I mean, everybody would. But I think this is something which has many stakeholders, including most of all the people of Afghanistan and those who have been elected to represent them. So when we say Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled, Afghan-led, I mean, that for us is a serious statement. It's not a cliche. We are not impervious to the realities of what is happening out there, but we certainly hope that the enormous achievements of the last 18 years are safeguarded in whatever sort of direction developments go in Afghanistan. Regarding your question about, trade, should it be bilateral, multilateral? It's not a matter of preference, because if there are powerful economies which want to bilateralize trade more, I might want it more multilateral, but the reality is the reality. So I may not be able to engage them in a multilateral format, and which may make me do that. I mean, if you look actually at the growth of FTAs, I mean, the growth of FTAs itself is a move away from multilat to plurilat. If you've reached FTAs, I mean, conceptually, what's so bizarre about a bilateral agreement? My sense is, obviously, India has a very strong commitment towards the WTO. That is our preferred forum for any outcomes and any dispute resolutions. But having said that, in real life, I have to go with what I have. In terms of, what you asked me about President Trump and the reaction of the media. Well, yeah, the president doesn't consult me on everything he does. Maybe it would be a good idea. But on the publicity for the reaction of the media, look, my sense is the media is reacting because there is a change of status quo. That what was a long-standing position has changed, and in my view, it's a good thing it's changed. And most of them don't have the diligence, the history, the understanding of the complexity of all of this. So there's a lot of sort of knee-jerk reactions which are, it's almost like things became bad on August 5, and by implication, everything was good before August 5. So, frankly, I find a lot of it very superficial, but then it doesn't entirely surprise me. On the institutions, look, again, part of the changing world, I cite to you export control regimes as a case where we have entered institutions and we have benefited. I think the institutions have benefited. I think Western countries have benefited by our presence out there. So those would be, to me, good examples of this enlarged reach out. I mean, what in a sense Atlantic Council is advocating is actually happening through these sort of examples. Quad is a somewhat different proposition because, Quad is actually not so much an institution. It's like a kind of a diplomatic mechanism for comparing notes and kind of checking the convergence temperature, if you would. And I don't think any of us have any intention of institutionalizing it in that sense in which, say, export control regimes would be. But there are a number of other institutions which had their history in some kind of Western thinking and which have then sort of broadened out either through outreach or through greater inclusiveness. And I think those are really interesting possibilities where we are concerned. And finally, the last question on the diaspora. Look, I'd put it to you very, very simply. Obviously, what happens to the Indian diaspora matters to us, and when anything, of the kind which you mentioned happens, you actually see reactions out of India. Nothing, thank God, has happened on my watch, but my predecessor publicly raised her voice on many of these occasions. But I don't think you should confuse that and what happened in Houston. Because if you see in Houston, for us, it was really the President of the United States and members of the Congress coming out there. And the answer to your question actually was given by the reaction of all the 50,000 people who were in the stadium. So they understood what it was about, and for them the presence of the President was honoring the Indian American community, and that's how they reacted.
Mr. Minister, thank you so much for your time, for your forthright answers, and for coming to the Atlantic Council. I suspect for many of us, because we are such fans of India and of a stronger US-India relationship, many of our questions might hint at various sources of frustration that the relationship isn't stronger, deeper, but it's only because we want to be partners to India and to the United States in forging that relationship. So in that spirit, I hope you will see us as a resource, come back. Please, Ambassador Shingla, please know that we are here always. At the end of this, please stay seated while the ambassador and the minister exit the room, just so they can get down to the elevator to their next meetings. I want to take a moment to thank my team here at the South Asia Center and at the Atlantic Council for putting this together, and very much to all of you for coming. Damon?
Just a very brief word to close this out, Mr. Minister. In your remarks, you said that India didn't have a seat at the table in 1945 as what were the founders of this institution were helping to build the principles of rules-based international order. The Dean Acheses and the Christian Herders that created the Atlantic Council were present at the creation. What we're working on now, and why we see this relationship as so important, in fact, in an effort that Paul is involved in with Ash, Steve Hadley, Michelle Flournoy, Secretary Albright are leading, how are we present at the reinvention and understanding that we have to not defend the past, but shape a better future in which shared principles and values underpin that. And in this time, where India has a full seat at the table, working with us to shape that international order. That's what's at stake right now. That's why we value the partnership and have an ambitious agenda of what we can do together. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you.